All right, so we are live. I am Chelsea Parkinson. I am the Director of Coaching at PPCaDI, and I am joined by two of my wonderful coaches, and we're really excited to be here today to chat with you, to talk about some really important topics around emotional regulation and workplace burnout. So before we jump into our topic of the day, I will turn it over to my coaches to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Kathleen Costello. I am one of the leadership coaches for PPCaDI, and emotional regulation is one of my favorite topics, and I'm excited to be on with both of these ladies in order to help support you in understanding this topic more deeply.
My name is Stephanie Labonte. I'm also a leadership coach with PPCaDI, and I have a passion around self-compassion, which I believe directly relates to emotional regulation and how we can kind of sit with ourselves when we're in these sort of burnout states. So I'm excited to hear from both of you and to share what we all know, and hopefully all learn from each other in this space.
Yeah, what I love about the way that we do these conversations is we all have varied backgrounds, we all have different ways to approach emotional regulation, but what brings us all together is wanting people to know how to emotionally regulate to improve their wellness, and especially in the workplace, work from home, and some of us being back in the office, burnout is very real, and being able to have tools and tips to help you manage your emotional space so that you can get ahead of things like burnout and know how to show up in that situation, I think will be a really beneficial outcome of our chat today. All right, so let's just start by kind of talking about emotional regulation. What is it? Why is it important? And what do you think about when you hear the term emotional regulation?
Transparently, I think before I got into coaching and really diving into it, I had thought of it in the past, years ago, as suppressing emotions, as sort of making sure that you don't show how you actually feel and you keep control of yourself. And I have learned since then that that is not what we mean, at least not what I mean when I think about emotional regulation. I think of it more now as empowering myself and taking back control, and giving myself more autonomy in the situations that I'm in. And I know we'll talk more about it as we go through our conversation, but that's sort of been my shift over time, and thinking of it as suppressing and hiding who I am, where now I feel like it helps me show up better as more of myself. It's almost the reverse.
Yeah, I love that distinction. It's not suppressing.
I can relate, Stephanie. I think sometimes when I hear emotional regulation, to me, it sort of stops me in my tracks because it feels like it's not maybe allowing this full range of experience. And I've come to look at it as actually, it's more about actually really checking in to understand what's going on ourselves so we can be more informed with how we want to respond both to ourselves and other people. So I think sometimes the regulation part is that particular word can have different connotations. I might call it like emotional choice, like what do we want to do with these emotions that arise for us in any given moment? Yeah. And so there's so much to it to unpack.
Yeah. Kind of like continuing to pull that thread, I think for me, the concept of emotional regulation, and you could sub lots of words in for regulation, is the relationship with your emotions. To be able to be unafraid to access even those emotions that fall kind of at the less favorable part of the emotional spectrum, and to know that you can be in relationship with any of your emotions and they don't have to be the driver of your experience. So the choice that you just said, Kathleen, the ability to be authentic, like Stephanie was talking about with your emotions, and not having to be afraid that how you're feeling has to equal how you show up. So bringing your emotions back to say, I can be sad and also get to have a choice in what that looks like. I can be angry and get to have a choice in what that looks like. So for me, emotional regulation is about supporting your emotions and knowing that you get to decide how they show up in space. Yeah. What do you guys think the relationship between emotional regulation and burnout is? Like, how would you describe why we're putting those two things in the same space today?
I can jump in. I think actually kind of going back to what we've all just shared is actually sometimes the burnout comes from not actually honoring our emotions. It's in that trying to repress them, pretend they're not there, not acknowledge them, not maybe ask a few deeper questions about why we're feeling something. Then burnout becomes sort of almost a natural byproduct, right? Because if we're pushing, not actually checking in, not asking what we may need in a given situation to feel more balanced, then I think we do end up burning out. And I think we're seeing that so much more often now in our society because there is this kind of, maximizer, do as much as we possibly can, go, go, go. And I think there's also, this tendency of sort of needing to put on a front that everything's good. Like I'm good, I'm busy, I'm stressed, but I'm good. Everything's good.
Right.
And when that may not always actually be the case for us.
Yeah. Hmm.
I love that you bring that up. But actually, I will not go down this rabbit hole. But I had an experience recently where I've been trying to be more in touch with naming my emotions, right? And because I'm feeling burned out, and people ask me at work, "How are you doing?" And I am burnt out both personally and professionally. And I have found if I say to someone, "I'm mostly good," "Oh, really? What's wrong?" Like they really just people have a cognitive dissonance around having those conversations, but they can be so therapeutic, especially in the burnout space. So I won't go down that rabbit hole, but it was interesting connection. I actually researched the definition of burnout before our conversation, and I found interesting the first two that came up are not related to people, but are related if you listen to them. So this is what they said: the reduction of a fuel or substance to nothing through use of combustion.
Hmm.
So that's kind of what you were getting at, Kathleen. And then the second one is the failure of an electrical device or component through overheating.
Hmm.
And I think about how when we're not in touch with our emotions, when we're not making those powerful choices, when we are suppressing instead of regulating, or we're just letting them control us all over the place, both of those scenarios can get to where we have burned up all of our fuel. We are empty because we haven't looked at what we have available and chosen or used our power of choice, our just our way of being able to approach the world from a choice perspective of how we use our fuel, and then we get to a burnout state. So I think this is so important to talk about burnout with this emotional regulation component, so we don't use up all our fuel or have an electrical fire happening in our brains.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like emotional responsibility is what you're saying. While you were talking about that, what was coming up for me is a car. And if you have no fuel in your tank and you haven't taken care of your brakes and you haven't checked in on these bits and pieces, which you could equate to your emotions, then you run out of your ability to use those things. And then you have to stop. You have to take the time to put it all in order. Your car is going to be in the shop for days and days while all of these things, and your brain and your emotions are kind of the same way. So it's a responsibility aspect of, do you know how to be in relationship with your emotions so that you can check in with them? And almost like preventative maintenance, right? Like we go to the dentist twice a year if we're on top of it. We go to the dentist twice a year for preventative maintenance to say, oh, you need to brush your teeth more, use fluoride or whatever they tell you. And so the preventative maintenance of our emotions and the responsibility around our emotions is what allows us to get ahead of something like burnout. Because if I got to pay a little bit more attention to my stress or to my irritation or whatever emotion that's coming up for you, then the preventative maintenance around that can help you get ahead of all of those things that Stephanie just said about electrical, faulty wiring that gets burnt out.
And I can, just to take that analogy one step further, because why not?
Right.
I think if we think about emotions as being kind of the warning lights that would come on our dashboard, right? Something that might say like, oh, check your engine, or, it's time for regular maintenance. And I think particularly when we're feeling emotions that are on the less desirable end of the spectrum, it can be easier to want to ignore them or avoid them or even dissect them, compared to just actually kind of setting back and thinking, why am I feeling this right now? And is this a little bit of a red alert on my dashboard to say, oh, pay attention, your fuel's getting low, pay attention, maintenance required. But I think so often it's easier to kind of suppress or ignore them until then our car stalls and then we're on the side of the road trying to figure out what to do.
Right. The indicator light. I love that. I use that with clients all the time of your emotions are an indicator light. And if you think of them that way and just pause to consider what they're there to tell you, we learn so much, especially in a workplace setting. I can think of examples around, maybe there's a values clash, or maybe there's something that you haven't said that you need to say. And your emotions are that indicator light that's telling you, if you would just stop for a minute and put a little bit of effort into this thing of getting this thing checked out, we could be on our way on our journey. But if you ignore it, at some point in time, those tires do blow out. At some point in time, that fuel does run out. So what are we doing about that? Yeah, it's really powerful to think about how emotional regulation has so much impact on how you show up in the world and your ability to have the experience you want to be having regardless of your circumstances. So something that we wanted to talk about today is not just the concept of emotional regulation, right? Because that's really important and what emotional regulation is, but what do you do with that? So we've kind of chatted, we've spent the last 10-ish minutes talking about what we think emotional regulation is and why it's important in the workplace and its relationship to burnout. But really the crux of our conversation today is about different ways that you can step into your emotional regulation, because this is actually an active concept. It's not just in kind of ethereal, you can't have access to it. There are ways that you can emotionally regulate. So let's dive that direction. What do you guys have in your toolkits for the folks that are paying attention to us to work on some emotional regulation?
Well, go ahead, Stephanie.
We were both waiting in case, and then we
regulating.
Yes. I will start with just a couple of things that I started thinking of if from a starting point, and I don't know that they're often thought about as much, and they're more physiological in nature. I find, as with many things related to psychology and thinking about ourselves from sort of a psychological flexibility perspective of being able to move more fluidly in the world, based on our psychology, if I'm making sure that I'm drinking enough water, I'm getting at least 30 minutes of physical exercise and at least 10 minutes of either meditation or some sort of quiet journaling. Even though that's not directly related to what we're talking about, those three things can go a long way to helping my brain be ready for the next steps that we're likely going to talk about. So I wanted to kind of bring those up as especially if someone's new to this space and not used to thinking about your emotions, those are three really good places to start that can give you a good foundation for drink enough water, 30 minutes of physical activity, whatever works for you, and some sort of meditation, quiet, 10 minutes a day can really help sort of set a foundation.
Yeah, that vessel, because you as a vessel, you're not just the parts and pieces, you're a whole vessel of thinking and feeling and behaviors. And so each of those things that Stephanie just gave us help check in with parts of your vessel so that you're creating a baseline, right, to be able to do some of this deeper cognitive work.
Yeah, going again, following that analogy, I look at the things that Stephanie mentions as our regular maintenance. What are the 2 or 3 things that are important for each person in order to feel whole, to feel like they're making some time for themselves. Um, and I think the examples that Stephanie shared help, when we're doing mindfulness or meditation or any kind of body movement, walking, we're building our awareness muscle. We're starting to learn how to check in with ourselves more. And I think that really can help lay a strong foundation for actually how to be more effective at emotionally regulating by being able to say, okay, you know what, today I am a little dehydrated. I need more water. We've learned to check inward. By sitting quietly for 10 minutes, we can get a sense of what our inner landscape's doing. Are our thoughts all over the place? Are they, particularly, let's say, negative on a given day? That's going to affect the way we show up. And same thing with exercise, right? We can check in one day, we might be able to run for miles, and the next day it's like all I can do is get up and go out and walk, and that's great. Just to be able to assess where we are, I think lays a really important foundation to have that mindfulness of where we are, and then also hopefully start to develop some self-compassion that I know Stephanie talked about at the beginning of, okay, well, and how are we relating to our experience? The day that we might have wanted to go running, but really we only have the capacity to walk. Are we okay with that? Can we be gentle with ourselves and still honor that? And I think that can make huge strides in the way we bring self-compassion to our emotional experience as well.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm thinking about how we take everything you just said about self-compassion for our external world and turn that into our emotional regulation. Because some days, what your anger might need from you might look different than other days. And your environment, like I'm thinking I have a 2-year-old, right? So depending on my child's baseline for the day, that can have very serious impacts on my own baseline. Because if Kenna is in, tiny meltdown mode or lots of yelling or sassiness or what 2-year-olds do, I require a little bit more self-care internally, right? Like my internal engines need a little bit more attention from me in order to fire on all cylinders the way I would like to. So I think all of that, being able to check in with yourself of what do I need to support who I want and how I want to be today. There's so many things that go into it, but the center of gravity for all of this is being able to check in with yourself from a self-compassionate and non-judgmental state. Because if I give myself a hard time as a mom and say, well, I shouldn't be short with her, I shouldn't be flustered by the fact that the human I put on the earth is fussing at me, then I'm in judgment mode. And now I'm irritated with myself. I'm irritated with my daughter. That is not a compassionate baseline for who do I want to be? How do I want to be? And what do I need to get there? So I'm grateful that we're talking about all of these things that come back to your relationship with yourself and your compassionate approach to managing yourself.
And I think you bring up a great thing too, Chelsea, because the more we can recognize the type of relationship we have with ourselves, actually, the more that mirrors the type of relationships we can have with other people too. Like you're saying, if you do the work with yourself, how does that make you show up differently as a parent or, a partner, a spouse, a coworker? It's the inner work is so valuable in helping shape how we show up in our lives.
Yeah. Preventative is the word that I keep coming up with. And I feel like that's a very popular word in our current society at the moment, but it really does start with your ability to take responsibility for the things you can, which is, between your nose and the back of your head. There's lots of things in there that we can take responsibility for, and doing it from that self-compassionate approach, just being able to be curious about where does this reaction come from? Where does this bubble up come from? Are there things that happened earlier in my day that could have impacted what's going on now? And it's definitely the more you know, right? Like the more you know, the closer you can get to not just looking for symptoms, but root causes of what's happening for you so that you can start to change the environment from which you're reacting from. So I love that. I was thinking while both of you were talking that for me, the emotional responsibility and emotional regulation piece is active with breathing, because I'm a busy-minded person and I can get very much ahead of myself in trying to solve the emotion like a problem instead of slowing down and looking at it as an experience. And if I don't like sit and take a breath and turn inwards, I'm trying to symptom it. Well, this is a symptom and this is a symptom of this. And if I just don't do that, then this won't happen anymore. And now I'm find myself back in judgment. So for me, with especially for other people who might have a very active kind of get ahead of yourself brain, just having a breath and like sitting still for a minute. Usually it's in this chair where it's quiet in my office and I can just sit and go, okay, let me just breathe and slow down and think about this feeling. What is this feeling? Stephanie said it earlier, naming it, even just putting a name on it and saying this feeling is anger or this feeling is frustration. All right. Hey, frustration. How's it going? What are we doing? We're hanging out. Okay. And then I like some of the more somatic approaches to emotional regulation too, of, okay, frustration for me shows up tension in my shoulders, you know, like kind of a ball in my throat, or that anxious, I've forgotten something type of feeling, you know, right here above my rib cage. And being able to have the experience of the emotion reminds me that it is just an experience. And if I can touch base with my experience with the emotion, then I can start to say, okay, if I'm feeling it here, maybe I can release, take a breath, take my shoulders away from my ears. And the act of putting myself back in the driver's seat, the emotion might be in the passenger seat, but putting myself back in that driver's seat reminds me the emotion doesn't drive the car. The emotion doesn't drive me. And I love the little pops of control, which I think is a neutral term. I know some people don't love the idea of control, but it's important to feel in control of your own stuff, to feel in control and like you can manage your emotions. And for me as a person, and I'm sure there are people who will resonate with that, knowing that I have a little bit of control in a circumstance where I may have no other tether of control is grounding and empowering.
Chelsea, I think that you really helped identify why emotional regulation, the regulation part of it, is so important, because I think for many of us, we're not actually taught what to do with emotions. Like, we all have them, right? They're biologically part of our experience and they're impacted by so many things, right? Our biochemistry, what's been happening in our day, all these things. And so I think without a little bit, and that's why I'm glad we're doing this session and there's so much more education available now. I think so many of us don't know what to do with emotions, and even the more enjoyable ones, like, you know, when we're feeling a lot of joy, or and so I think what you're talking about being able to ground, actually lets us like be more with the emotion, and then, like you said, have a little more control with what we're going to do with them versus them controlling us. And, you know, I definitely grew up in a having experiences with, you know, adults who didn't know how to handle their anger, you know, constructively. Anger is a fine emotion. It's important. It's, you know, it can be related to feelings of injustice, and it can be very clarifying, but it can also be a very, for lack of a better word, dangerous emotion if it's not understood, if it's not regulated. And that's where I think, you know, we can move into this when the time is right, but kind of looking at some of the steps that we can take in order to actually see what's going on for us. We may not always know why, you know, we may not have all the ingredients of why this particular emotion's coming up, but being able to notice it, relate to it, like you said, in a non-judgmental way, and then assess, okay, what's the need? You know, is there a need here that I have? And then also, what do I want to do with it? And then that way we're not being controlled or swept along by this emotional experience. And the times that we are, because it's going to be inevitable, also being able to bring self-compassion, because we're not always going to be super aware. We're not always going to have those resources available, you know, and we are definitely, I have lost my cool at times, and then later was like, oh, could have handled that better, you know.
Just wait a few months from now, Kathleen, you're going to be in that cycle of it happens.
I'm preparing already. All the wonderful tools and things that I can share are going to be like out the window when I have a little one.
I was telling someone earlier that we were having this webinar and they're like, oh, I need to attend it. And I was like, I do too. That's why I'm on it. Like, we teach what we most need to be working on, and the more we talk about it, the more we can help. But we're always, all of us are always trying to do better. No one has this 100%. Something that I heard, and it connects to the vehicle sort of description, or what I pictured, you talk about having the emotion kind of in the back seat. I had heard this, it was a video, many people may have seen it, where you think about the emotion kind of not in the driver's seat, right? In the back seat. You're not kicking it out of the car. That's the suppression part, right? You're letting it sit in the back seat and appreciating that it's there. It thinks that it's there for a good purpose. If it's an emotion that, like anger as an example,
Yeah.
it's there to help you. It's there for a purpose that it thinks is serving you in some way. So if you can, sort of what Kathleen mentioned, if you can find what that serving aspect of that emotion is, that can be really helpful, especially to try to get out of that judgment space, because oftentimes, especially when it comes to anger, disgust, irritation with other people, when we start to feel similar feelings about ourselves when we're in that space. But it's helped me a lot to sort of sit back and look at an emotion and say, what are you trying to tell me? I know you're here to help me. You're not being super helpful right now.
Right.
How can you be more helpful? And being real with it has been something that's helped me over time.
Yeah. And it's curiosity, right? One of our principles of curiosity, like how can you be curious about what that emotion is there to tell you? And I always bring it back to like primal humans. If we think about everything that has come with us, everything that we've been given was provided for a purpose, and survivalism and primal, like all of those emotions that we tend to label, they had very important purposes. They're the only reason that any of us are even here to talk about this, because if we hadn't honored our fear, hadn't gotten angry that things didn't work, and then figured out how they worked, the wheel, like pick a thing. I always talk about plumbing. The fact that you have a bathroom in your house is because somebody got real irritated with walking out in the snow. So we have to appreciate that emotions have been catalysts for change. Certainly right now, look out in our world. If we didn't have the emotions that we have about things that are happening in our world, nothing would happen. We do nothing about these things that are happening. So I like to remind people kind of this whole line of they're here for a reason. Get curious about that emotion, right? Like I'm big on starting with your values, because those emotions that sit in the less favorable part of the spectrum tend to be there to indicate or light to you that something that's important to you has been dishonored, has been clashed with, isn't present, especially in the workplace. When we think about burnout and when our negative emotions come out to play at work, a lot of time it's because, for me, if I couldn't make an impact or I was feeling unheard, I was not a happy camper. There were some very negative emotions that came out to play. And as soon as I became aware of that, I could say, okay, in this scenario, I'm feeling angry because somebody spoke over me at a meeting, or, what we could have done, who we could have reached with this thing, we just let it die. And so the impact piece wasn't there. And then I can take back my responsibility and say, okay, if I want to be heard, what's my role and responsibility there? If I want to make an impact, because that's the only part I control. I can't control if other people talk over me in a meeting. I can ask all day long for people to not do that. But I got to come back to what's my role and responsibility with this thing. And again, to Stephanie's point, that puts me back in my own driver's seat, lets that emotion be there somewhere in the car. And I can say, hey, thanks for turning the light bulb on to the fact that I wasn't heard. And what do I want to do about that? So I love that it can also give you an action piece where you don't just have to sit in your spin cycle of emotion. I'm going to sit here and stew and be angry and come up with new ways to be angry. And then I'm going to be angrier. Whoa, no. I'm going to be angry, validate my anger, say, hey, anger, let's chat about what you're here to tell me and what happened. And then if we put that action piece on it, we've neutralized that emotion a little bit. We've validated it. We haven't pretended that it's not okay to feel that way, but now we're doing something with it. And so we can turn every emotion, every single one can be turned into impactful fuel for something that's really important to you. So for active people like me, right? Like if you have a busy brain and you need to be doing the things, active emotional regulation that has a tether, and that's not for everybody. Not everybody needs to have an action tethered to it, but that's one cadre of ways that we can turn emotional regulation into an active kind of process.
A way a mentor of mine talks about, if you look at the word emotion, it's really like energy in motion, right?
Mm,
So emotions have an energy to them. And like you said, they can drive all kinds of actions. I actually don't know that as humans, we would be very motivated without them, to be quite honest. That the limbic part of our brain that helps us feel things helps motivate us. I mean,
right.
think about even going back to the idea of like child rearing. If we didn't have emotion, talk about really evolutionarily, would
We
we
couldn't
take
do it.
care of our young?
Right.
Would our species continue?
Right.
My partner and I were watching Animal Planet, this wild babies show, and I was so touched to see how all these different animals, penguins, lions, turtles, I mean, there's a natural innate care
Right.
that comes out when a baby of any type is born, in order to foster its well-being and its life, its life.
Yeah.
And again, I think there is an emotional component to that.
Mm,
And so exactly like what you said, Chelsea, without them, would we really be
what would
motivated?
we do? Yeah,
Like,
Yeah.
we do.
and the desirable emotions too, right? I think joy, love, care, those motivate us in other ways too, to build connection, to create belonging, to include others. So just as much as sometimes the more challenging emotions can drive us or be very attention getting, the more enjoyable emotions perhaps also really tend to help motivate us to create closeness and
Yeah.
bonding. And
Yeah.
so I don't know that I would want to know what our species would be like if we didn't have emotions.
No, we would be so
Yeah.
different in the amazing things that we're capable of. Forget which coach I was listening to, and I would love to give credit if I could remember who it was, but said everything we do is based on the way we want to feel. It doesn't matter what it is: eating, seeking a new job, looking for a romantic partner. Everything is based on an emotion that we have decided that thing will make us feel.
Mhm.
So emotions, truly, we it's so funny how they are the driver of everything, and yet we have mismanaged them for so long, not on purpose, but because we didn't know. We
Mhm.
didn't understand how to close the circle between emotions in your brain, emotions as a result of an experience, when really it's just a circle of learning your emotions, knowing you have your emotions, knowing you're in the driver's seat of your emotional experience is what allows you to perceive the relationship between an experience and the emotion. And all you have to do, like child rearing is a great example of this, is look at different people's experience with child rearing to know there is no promise that any singular thing creates a specific emotion. You have to be very intentional.
Yes.
Like, I love my daughter more than the world, but I gotta be really intentional sometimes to be like, I love you more than the world. What does that look like here?
Mm.
Because right now, child, I gotta tell you what, this is not feeling like love. And stepping back into that ownership of it, of how do I want to feel here, is another
Mhm.
great way to emotionally regulate. Is just because my reactive emotion might be frustration or tear my hair out or whatever it is, doesn't mean that has to be my whole experience. And part of emotional responsibility and emotional regulation is going, how can I go from, because there's probably an emotion, if that one isn't serving you. And again, sometimes anger and fear, anxiety, they are very purposeful, and they're there to tell you something, right? And if I think about, if we keep pulling the thread on parenting, if I think about when those come out to play for me as a parent, they're there to tell me I'm probably judging myself as a mom when she's having a tantrum, when we're in the middle of Target and she's, on the floor doing whatever she's doing because we didn't buy a candy bar. And if I'm angry, if I'm frustrated, if I'm anxious, I probably have to figure out what's the story I'm telling myself. And it's always about me. It's not actually about Kenna. It's, oh God, other people are in Target and Kenna's throwing things or this or that. I have to slow down and say, okay, thank you, emotions, for popping up and telling me that I'm worried about other people.
Mhm.
Is that the experience I want to be having right now? Do I want to care? Well, most of those other people have kids. They've probably been here, right? So it allows you to steep yourself in how I'm being into how do I want to be, and what's the thinking that supports me moving that direction.
Oh
And
gosh.
it connects so beautifully back to what you mentioned too around values as well, Chelsea, which is one of our PPCaDI principles of, okay, what do I value and how do I want to show up? Like, okay, if I'm feeling particularly frustrated, kindness is one of my highest values. And so it's like, okay, what do I need to do to react to this person if I've been on customer service for an hour trying to rebook my flight and I really know it's not this person's fault, but I'm getting really, really frustrated because
Right.
I need this done.
Yeah.
How do I muster and connect to that value so that I can still be kind to this customer service person who is really trying their best and I'm just getting frustrated, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that values piece is huge, because sometimes, kind of going back to the action, being able to link on to something that in a way is sometimes stronger than the emotion, right? Like, okay, is my value of kindness more important than me feeling really frustrated right now? And can I link into that as something to help me regulate this emotion?
Oh gosh. A lot of what you're saying makes me think about, Chelsea, you were describing emotions, and then I was picturing then emotions in the workplace. For so long, it's felt like emotions are not part of the workplace. That was part of the compartmentalizing of emotions are in your personal life, and then you're a professional. And I do see that adjusting over time. I actually think the pandemic helped that a little bit because we came into each other's homes more and saw more of each other in general. So I'm happy to see that those conversations are happening more, and I hope that's something that sticks around, because I do feel like having conversations and recognizing, just like you said, Chelsea, even in the workplace, everything we do is because we want to feel a certain way. So to say emotions and feelings don't belong is disingenuous. It's perhaps only saying certain feelings and emotions are allowed, but the others are not, but we are still whole people.
Right.
So to segment it in that way is not a natural way.
No,
For
and
us,
it's so ineffective, right?
right?
Because it chops off part of who you are. And if you think about cognitive, like I always think of the brain as a pie chart. And because the brain is so complicated that if I don't make it into something kind of tangible, lost. But if I think about it as a pie chart and everything that happens in it is 100%, wouldn't you want your folks at work to bring 100% of themselves, so that, because you can't decide, well, if you have to leave your personal life at home, you don't get to choose which part of their brain that is. You don't get to choose which percentage of that you're saying. You just chop off that part of your brain. Well, some of that they're going to need for what they're doing at work. Like I think about my parenting. My parenting and having a child has made me such a different manager, because my understanding of what other people have going on at home, if they have kids, and even just watching emotional evolution from a toddler standpoint, and knowing, well, what about my folks who didn't have a parent that was a coach and a mindset expert and somebody with a mental health background? The ability to be empathetic too to those experiences. So if I didn't bring my mama self to my job, my staff would not be getting the manager they're getting.
Right.
They'd be getting somebody who has no empathy, who doesn't care what they've got going on in their private lives, and essentially saying, hey, cut off your arm, but I expect you to use both hands. Cool. Thanks. That sounds like great management, right? So the empathetic approach of, we don't get to decide how our people became the experts that they are. We don't get to decide which things from their entire experience made them who they are professionally. And when we start deciding for them which bits they can't bring, that's what we're doing. We're saying, we hired you because you're amazing. You're really good at what you do. You're the best at this. You're so technically expert. But you might have gotten that from 45 different places in your life. We only want 30 of those to come to work. But still do your job like you have all 45.
And then we're inadvertently contributing as leaders, contributing to the burnout of our employees, because you're not letting them start even with a full tank, to go back to the original analogy, where it's saying start out with half a tank, but we want you to go as far as a full tank would take you.
Yeah.
They're going to burn out, and then perhaps not have all the resources available for emotional regulation because they weren't able to bring all of those resources with them. It's truly connection. That's why I think self-compassion, if we think about emotional regulation for ourselves and having this understanding, can then help us be better leaders, because it can help us then understand, if I need this, so also do the people that report to me. And how can I help them feel supported that they can do these same things? And then it becomes a much better cycle of an upward spiral instead of a downward spiral of everyone burning out. And
Right.
And I think that's where the emotional regulation piece comes in too, because having worked in a lot of environments where really bringing emotions probably either was not welcome or maybe not appropriate. But I'm also thinking about even as a coach, right? So when I'm working with a client, the session's really about them.
Right.
And though I want to show up as my full self, and if something in my experience is useful to helping the coaching experience or helping the client, I may bring that in. But I think that's where the emotional regulation piece is also really empowering, because if I've had a bad day, if something's gone awry, I can use these steps, which we'll talk about, to check in with myself before a session or before a meeting or before something where I'm not going to be able to express my full self. But I know I've gotten to do some of the work within me to be able to show up the way I need to in that space until I can have the safe conversation, until there's a safe space, or, perhaps after I've coached a client, I can go call a friend or have some time. And so I think that's where, because if we don't know how to emotionally regulate, I think there is a tendency to kind of inadvertently bring it with us, right? So it's almost like we may be in a space where it's either not welcome or not appropriate, let's say, but we're still kind of showing up with it, like the disgruntled manager who's kind of saying passive aggressive things in the meeting. Or if I'm with a client and I'm making the whole session about my stuff, which would be, in my opinion, not appropriate,
Right.
then I've actually done a poor job of emotionally regulating because I didn't kind of read the room. I didn't see what was needed from me in that situation. And that can be really hard when we have some strong emotions coming up. And so I hope, when we can share some tools, that those will be the kind of things that can help us when there isn't either that psychological safety in the workplace, or
Right.
we're just in an environment where we kind of have to pull it together for a moment, but
Right.
not pull it together in a way that's suppressing, but pull it together in a way that, okay, I've given myself 2 or 3 minutes to check in and assess, and then I can temporarily put it to the side until I can address it skillfully after.
Yeah. And appropriately for yourself, right?
Mhm.
We're going to transition into Kathleen's steps in just a second. What's coming up for me while you're talking about that is remembering what you said before, that emotions are energy, and that they don't just put energy in your space, they put energy in others' space. And that is your responsibility too. Not to be inauthentic and to pretend that everything is okay, but to think about who you want to be for yourself and in relationship with other people. And to your point, as coaches, our responsibility is to be able to hold space for others. And if we can't emotionally regulate before a session, we can't do that thing that's so important to us, that is the lifeblood of why we do what we do. And I think you can apply that in almost any situation. And it's not to say, to Kathleen's point, that I won't address what's happening for me, but a value of mine too is who I am as a coach. So it's in that moment going, is it more important to be irate from the customer service person and to bring that into my session? Or is it more important to me to be able to be that coach I want to be? Doesn't mean I'm not going to deal with this. We're not kicking it out of the car. We're just asking it to go into the back seat for a little while because somebody else needs to be in the passenger seat with us.
Mhm.
And having that ability to realize your emotions are energy for yourself and for others, and how you want to be energetically is a beautiful byproduct of emotional regulation and responsibility. You can decide, anger, I'm not done with you, but there's also room for other things, and I'm going to come back. So sit tight, stay right there.
I love all the inadvertent vehicle analogies that have come up, putting the emotion in the back seat. Who do I want in my passenger seat? So, yeah, when in doubt, just think about the car analogies, right?
It's so good. It's so good for so many things with the brain. And I love it because there's so many tangible driving to your destination, so many places that we can use a car. Okay, so we've got about 5-ish minutes left of our discussion today, and I want to be sure that we leave you guys with a few more actionable ways to practice emotional regulation. And Kathleen came up with a really beautiful acronym. She's the acronym queen. Acronym for how to remember to emotionally regulate. So I'm going to let her take us through that, and then we'll be on our way to emotionally regulating our vehicles.
Awesome. Well, and I create acronyms mainly because I need things to be simple and things that I can remember easily because my memory is not what it used to be. So when I was looking at different resources and thinking about some of our own on emotional regulation, there's so many good things out there and we could list them all out, but then I would be afraid you would leave this call and have maybe remember one. So I came up with the acronym SPACE. And I think even if you can just remember the word, I think that can be really useful because going back to what Chelsea and Stephanie talked about kind of creating some time and space or stopping for a minute to just check in. And so the S in space is stop. So if you're starting to feel something coming up, take a pause, take a moment to stop. Then the P is physical check in. So this goes back to what we've talked about around the somatic awareness. So you've stopped, you're checking in, what's going on in your body? You know, is your stomach tight or do you feel butterflies in your stomach? Are your shoulders at your ears? You know, what are the somatic indicators telling you about what you may be feeling? Or perhaps it's joy. Maybe you feel really effervescent and light. The A in space is to acknowledge whatever it is you're feeling. So let's say in this case, maybe it's anger. So to acknowledge it, not push it away, and accept it, to accept that it's there. So it's kind of a double A, acknowledge and accept. And then the C is choose how you want to respond. So we've spent a lot of this session talking about reconnecting to values, deciding how you want to show up. So even though the anger is there and you validated it, how do you want that anger to inform? You know, do you need to bring up something? Do you need to share an injustice? What do you need to do with it? And then the last E is engage in positive self-talk. So that's that self-compassion piece of, not judging ourselves for what we're feeling, but really telling ourselves, okay, it's okay that I feel this way, and I want to move in this direction. So just to review it again, so SPACE is the acronym, and it's stop, physical check-in, acknowledge and accept, choose how to respond, and engage in positive self-talk. And so my hope is that even if you can remember one or two of those, it's really the step in the direction of being able to emotionally regulate more easily. And, that tool can be something you offer to coworkers. It can be for children. It can be for our spouses. You can offer that to anyone that you think could benefit in being able to work with their emotions more constructively.
That's so good. And for any of our viewers, anybody who's watching this later, Kathleen doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to ask her to make us a short video for our socials where you can watch that over again in case you don't want to dig back through this video. So you can find us on LinkedIn and Instagram, and we will have this tool for SPACE on our social medias so that you can connect with yourself, so that you can figure out an actionable and simple, Kathleen made it super simple for you, way to just be in relationship with your emotions, right? So if we leave you with nothing else today, emotions do not have to be the driver of your experience. You do not have to push them so far that you are burnt. You have burned through all the fuel. You have burned through all the electrical wiring because your emotions took control and we didn't get them into a manageable space, right? None of us are perfect. You're going to have pops of emotion. You're going to have reactive emotions. That is going to happen no matter how much emotional regulation you practice. However, knowing that a lot of the time you can step into yourself, practice some choice about who you want to be and how you want to feel, it's really empowering. And if you're a leader, this is something that starts with you, right? It starts with how you emotionally regulate and manage your authenticity in an emotional responsibility space, and giving your employees the space and tools to do the same for themselves. So we appreciate if you join us afterwards. If you've joined us today, we've loved talking about this. We'll be back next month with a discussion on being a positively diverse leader, which is our 3-day program. It's our core structure of how to show up as a positively diverse leader, support your communication, support diverse populations at work, and just to change the face of leadership and change the face of the way that our workplaces are organized and the way that we show up. So we hope that you will join us next month for that conversation. I want to, of course, say thank you to Kathleen and to Stephanie for joining me today. As always, it's a great discussion when we're all here together. And don't forget to look us up on our socials because we've got great stuff all over the place. Ladies, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.